Good afternoon, or good evening as the case may be, and welcome to this afternoon's panel on cities, regionalism, fiscal responsibilities, and intergovernmental arrangements. My name is Enid Slack, and I'm the director of the Institute on Municipal Finance and Governance at the Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy at the University of Toronto. I know this is a virtual event, and some of you are here in Toronto where I am, some are in other parts of Canada or the rest of the world. But I would like to acknowledge the land on which the University of Toronto operates. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Senecas, and most recently, the Mississaugas of the Credit River. Today, this meeting place is still the home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land and to talk about cities. I'm delighted to be here at this summit on constitutional space for cities, and I'd like to thank Natalie DeRosier and the others at Massey College for the invitation to moderate this panel. Today, we're going to be talking about how to pay for local services and infrastructure. At IMFG, at our institute, we've written a number of papers on many of the topics that we've heard about over the last few days, or the last couple of days, on powers and resources and cities and national constitutions and charter cities. We've tried to highlight some of these papers. I'm guilty of putting them in the chat with links, and so has Zach Taylor and others. But recently at IMFG, we've been concerned about the impact of COVID-19 on municipal finances. What has really been striking about this pandemic is just how much cities are on the front lines when it comes to delivering essential services. Obviously, they're involved in public health, emergency shelters, and social services. But cities also deliver public transit and garbage collection and disposal, and police and fire protection, and many more services. And they're responding to this crisis with a very limited source of revenue, largely property taxes, user fees, and transfers from federal and provincial governments. COVID-19 has meant higher expenditures and lower revenues. It's what UCLG, United Cities and Local Governments, calls the scissor effect. Expenditures are going up, revenues are going down. You can see the scissors going. And the result has been that municipalities in Canada and elsewhere are facing unanticipated operating deficits. Well, the federal government in Canada has come to the rescue, largely because it has the most money and the greatest ability to borrow, reflecting the vertical fiscal imbalance in this country. But we ask ourselves, is this fiscal model that we're relying on really sustainable for cities going forward? The other thing we found in this pandemic is the impact has been different in different cities. The OECD says it's an asymmetric impact of COVID-19 on municipal finances, and it depends on what expenditure responsibilities your city has, what sources of revenue they have, what was their fiscal health going into the pandemic, how much fiscal flexibility do they have, what role do the senior governments play, etc. So in our session this afternoon, our speakers are going to look at how to address the differences in the ability of local governments to deliver services. We will look specifically at equalization, horizontal equalization among municipalities within a region, as well as vertical equalization with funds, in the case today from the federal government, could be provincial governments to municipalities. We'll also look at a bottom-up, rights-based approach that focuses on the citizen taxpayer. We may see a bit of a conflict here between equalization and a focus on citizen taxpayers. Should lead to a very interesting discussion. So the plan for the next hour and a half is I'm going to introduce the panelists. We have 3 panelists and 1 discussant. The details of their bios are in the chat, and I'm not going to read them out. I'm just going to tell you who they are. Each speaker will have 15 minutes to speak, followed by the discussant, who will have 10 or 15 minutes. And then I will give these speakers a bit of an opportunity to respond to the discussant's comments, and then we'll open it up to the audience for Q&A. Those of you who have been with us for the last couple of days know that you can put your questions in the chat. I will monitor those questions and pose them to the panelists. So our first speaker will be Mary Janigan. Mary's a journalist and historian in Toronto. I like to publicize people's most recent books. Her most recent book is called The Art of Sharing, The Richer versus the Poorer Provinces Since Confederation, which is published by McGill Queen's University Press. She will be followed by Giovanna Tieghi. Giovanna is an adjunct professor in the Department of Public, International, and Community Law at the School of Law at the University of Padua in Italy. Our third speaker is Rémi Poirot. Rémi is a PhD student in public law at the Sorbonne Law School at the University of Paris. And our discussant is Danielle Bellon. Danielle is the director of the McGill Institute for the Study of Canada, and he is the James McGill Professor in the Department of Political Science at McGill University in Montreal. So if I could, over to Mary.
Thank you. I would like to speak about the possibility of equalization for cities. When Natalie asked me to play with the idea, I thought, well, okay, why not? But the more I looked into the idea, the more I became convinced that it was actually an idea that was workable and would even be beneficial. Sounds crazy. It comes close to answering Professor Tieghi's wish for more citizen input into how funds are spent. And I think properly designed, it would give more funds than Professor Poirot is seeing going to other municipal councils. It might work. I began by looking at the abject conditions of city councils, all of them, all across Canada, begging for money, running out of funds, desperate for more input from senior levels of governments. They have to beg. It's time consuming, and it really struck me as anachronistic. Cities may be at the center of wealth creation in Canada, but they are constitutional orphans, really. They're at the bottom of the pecking order, creatures of the provinces. Their revenue-raising schemes can be overruled. Look at Toronto in 2016, when the province overruled the City of Toronto's plans for road tolls. It seems a bit humiliating, especially in 2021 with the pandemic raging and the responsibilities there are on cities. Meanwhile, the infrastructure needs of Canadian cities are enormous. The Public Policy Forum estimated that Canadian governments need anywhere from 500 to 750 billion, for infrastructure over the next 10 years. Cities are responsible for 60% of infrastructure, but collect only 10% of taxpayer dollars. That's the Federation of Canadian Municipalities. Large chunks, as we have just heard, of municipal services come from property taxes, user fees. Property taxes don't increase with economic growth. Meanwhile, they're paying for so much more than they are able to fund. So what about equalization? It's an innovative way now in Canada to bring equity to inequality among provincial governments based on their fiscal capacity, that is, their ability to raise revenues. The first federal checks went out on April 1st, 1957. It's non-conditional. The formula is relatively transparent. There are no application forms. It binds the country into a moral and deeply pragmatic agreement to help poorer governments. What if we applied that approach to cities? I set limits on this theoretical exercise because there's only one taxpayer. In the beginning, at least, the money would go from all federal taxpayers to the larger municipal economic powerhouses. I suggested either the 15 big cities that qualified under Ottawa's Rapid Housing Initiative, or the 22 cities in the Big City Mayors Caucus of the Federation. I selected larger cities because they have costs that the smaller ones don't have, such as transit or the provision of large amounts of public housing. Pardon me. But I had to make it work in terms of its design. I considered the possibility of repurposing a goodly chunk of the 12-year, $180 billion Investing in Canada plan, which Infrastructure Canada and 20 other federal departments and agencies deliver. That's 21 federal departments and agencies delivering funds, each with their own conditions, each with their own infrastructure. And I thought we could repurpose, heresy perhaps to Ottawa, we could repurpose the way those funds are put out. Infrastructure Canada, the Investing in Canada plan does include the gas tax fund, which sends more than $2.3 billion a year to 3,600 communities. It's a permanent source of flexible funding. I really like the flexibility of being able to spend the money as you wish. It appeals to me. Large cities have sophisticated bureaucracies now. Surely the process could be streamlined by delivering the money through equalization to the big cities directly. There would be no application forms. There are none with provinces. It would be non-conditional. The cities could spend it as they wished. I think this would work with the cities. But how would the formula be calculated? I figured that if Ottawa could calculate the per capita amounts that these cities could raise from a small range of revenue sources, it would not be based on fiscal need. It would be based on the money that the cities could raise. Cities would not have to account how they spend it, but that would be as in equalization today. The provinces don't have to account. Why should the cities have to account? It should work out. So a fair amount of money repurposed from 21 departmental and agency spending budgets sent to cities on the basis of the revenues that they can raise from a small number of taxes or fees, obviously property taxes, obviously transit fees, obviously use of recreational cities, centers. This would work, I think. I may have perhaps become overly enthusiastic, but I could see how this would work. Now, federal politicians are probably reluctant to give up the right to cut ribbons, to stand front and center as they unveil what their money has done. I think they would arguably be better sending the money directly. It's true that cities would not have to account for how they spend the money, but there could be a caveat that it could be spent on infrastructure largely. That's what I think many people see as a huge lag. Cities could publicize the fact they're opening these infrastructure projects, but there would be no more having to run to Ottawa to beg for funds, to run to the province to beg for funds. There are arguments. The Fraser Institute in Canada, a rather more conservative institute, has argued that per capita municipal spending has risen to meet the available resources. And it cites rising wage amounts and the rising employment numbers. But this, I would argue that cities' responsibilities, the kind of expertise they need, has changed radically since the Fraser Institute began its calculations. It's really, I don't think we have cities spending wildly. And if they do, they're going to have to raise their fees and their property taxes in order to qualify for equalization. I think this might work. I thought it wouldn't when I began, and I have convinced at least one person myself that non-conditional equalization for the largest cities with a relatively transparent formula might be the way to head into the 21st century. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Mary. Somebody's just written in the chat, we need new ideas. This is one of them. It certainly is a new idea, the notion of federal municipal equalization. And I have a lot of questions. I'm going to save them to the end, but they have a little bit to do with where the province fits in and the provincial municipal equalization schemes that exist in Canada in half of the provinces now. But we will come back to that. I'm going to turn it over to Giovanna.
Thanks, Director Slack. Before starting my presentation, let me thank deeply Professor Nathalie Desrosiers and the organizing committee for the invitation. It's my personal pleasure to be representative of my University of Padua, Italy, where I'm based right now. So good afternoon to you all and good evening to all the attendees and participants from Europe and all over the world. As I was saying, it's a great honor to be part of this great event with these distinguished panelists and coordinators. Great event organized, I perceive, with the double aim of sharing academic interests and giving us the chance to challenge a new way of intellectual growth through comparison among different legal systems in such a great variety of comparative law fields. And that's why primarily, my speech will adopt a comparative perspective, starting from the Canadian case. The aim, in fact, today is, especially from my side, to encourage a dialogue through observations and opposite points of view, and also critique to what I've been led to consider one of the most crucial issues contemporary democracies have to face, how to consider the need of interaction between contemporary states and their urban civic society. From my side, the role of cities like as drivers of change, with a look at starting from the role of the citizen, the people and their connection with the institutional fiscal arrangements and responsibilities. So assuming the role of citizen as a crucial part of the so-called local process, and in terms of citizens' liberty, which depends on taxes, referring to the cost of rights book, while liberty depends on taxes, as the American United States scholars Holmes and Sustain supported. So to contextualize my thoughts, my topic, and my citizen-centered outlook, I'd like to start from the challenging, crucial assumption made by our session presentation that starts from the assumption that money matters. And I want to add, people matter. That's why other key questions connected with the models of equalization and the controversial topic of equalization, let me make two premises, two pre-requirements to better contextualize my point of view and my proposal. Thanks to many inputs I had from Mary and even Remy that I had have sharing this panel. So she was talking about shared cost programs and how about the shared prosperity as regards to Remy. And I want to look at the shared accountable path. That means kind of thinking of a fiscal exchange, a fiscal exchange between taxpayers and tax authorities. That means from governors to governed. And that is led to look at the need of an updating of the autonomies and territorial governance in a multiplicity of contemporary systems that requires the recourse of some traditional principles of constitutional law. First of all, the starting point is the concept of democracy as laboratory to be coordinated with the principle of autonomy and participation. That is helping us to shift to the second pre-requirement. When we talk about city equalization, looking at financial solidarity, I'd like to focus on cities' valorization. Valorizing the differences and the financial fairness made by the pluralistic local governments that we need to look at. So this contest prompts the theme for my remarks, especially considering global legal challenges on the city argument, to be evaluated in a distinctive comparative law perspective, a stimulating legal empirical way to face the ongoing debate about a target model of balanced citizen-state relationship through experimentation. So giving response to the state-local dichotomy and to the right to the city competing conceptions. So starting from the so-called right to experiment, starting from the dissenting opinion by Justice Brandeis, 1932, that was focused actually on the state legislatures, saying that states may, if its citizens choose, serve as laboratory of democracies. So it's a new approach, a combination between law and society. So the ongoing process of reconsidering the local scenario is presently emerging worldwide and is to be considered, that's my proposal, a recent alternative, not to oppose different levels of government, but to construct an updated bottom-up legal pattern, including the role of the citizen taxpayers and the effective value of his or her rights and responsibilities from a constitutional perspective. I think that's a challenge path towards new constitutional form of protection of resources, of course, needed, but even of local needs and preferences, as well as constitutional traditions. So that's a city-based oriented approach that in Europe can find its formal provision, its formal platform on the preamble of the Charter of Fundamental Rights of the European Union on the constitutional traditions. So that's why I propose to rethink, for the purpose of effectiveness, the city starting from the Canadian taxpayer town halls. So the idea of using forums for intergovernmental interaction. So towards the involvement of a new constitutional space. How to support this proposal? Let me start from the following basic assumptions that will drive us through the journey I submit to your consideration. First of all, the unquestionable importance of the constitutional nature of the relationship existing between governors and governed. Secondly, the need for a constitutional approach to explore how city charters can become a roadmap for an effective tax administration. Third, the new role of citizen taxpayers should take in an evolving constitutional state from subject to citizen, from partner to customer, considering the idea of a conception of taxpayer rights as human rights in order to let local government, that is governors, to earn legitimacy if they become accountable. So within the general framework of rights discourse, the Canadian official set of taxpayer rights, starting from the Canadian Human Rights Act, 1982 Canadian Constitutional Act with the Charters of Rights and Freedom, and then to the 1985 Declaration of Taxpayer Rights released by the Canadian Revenue Agency, and especially the operational role of the local taxpayers ombudsman, so the Office of Taxpayers Ombudsman, started contributing to a renewed public debate, maximizing the local component and the constitutional space for cities. The Canadian Taxpayer Council, that I refer you to my paper submitted for the conference for details. But what I want you to focus on is that the Canadian Taxpayer Councils embraced that challenge, so to renew the public debate, maximizing the local component. How? Considering the relationship between tax authorities and taxpayers as a constitutional problem. That means looking at the taxpayer advocate as in his or her crucial role of building trust through official reports, for the case for transparency and a new taxpayer advocates culture that is connected even in the way they conduct the town's halls. Second, the search for a legal model and legal technique that are necessary to let a taxpayer charter to be a fundamental part of legal sources in the same way the European Charter of Local Self-Government support the principle of subsidiarity as it is in the Italian Constitution. And third, the redefinition of a new role for the contemporary city taxpayer to accomplish an updated interpretation of dignity as item of balance between liberty and responsibility, focused on the local government. The Canadian Taxpayer Town Halls tried also to reply to cities' legal vulnerability or cities' struggle to respond to their communities in the suffer from their law constitutional stages. So the question is, how can we conceive the idea of tax dialogue to approach a different dynamic perspective? What kind of instruments of dialogue do we have to consider? I think it's a matter of confidence in local authorities, and it's a matter of accountability. So we need to think of a new architecture. It's a question of trust. It's a question of legitimacy, and especially of responsiveness. And we need new instruments, new. If we consider participatory budget, consultation, consultative referendum like we have in Italy. But we need to wonder whether international models can serve as an inspiration. Using the ancient idea of town meeting as a touchstone, the Canadian author has recently emphasized the potentialities of cities focusing on transparent and public dialogue. And this kind of city forums, benefiting from the previous US experience of the spatial public forum of taxpayer needs and preference, I think reflect the worldwide ongoing process of localizing democracy, fostering cooperative measures to facilitate communication and government cities interaction. So shifting from the involvement, the citizen involvement, to the engagement. So not just to vote, but to be part of the decision making. So that fosters us to wonder if can dialogue be considered an experimental source of law helpful for a new city's constitutional space? From my side, I think multiple implications, theoretical and operational, have to be considered. First of all, the contribution of the communicative action supporting the constitutional discourse theory by Habermas, the attempt to build dynamic human rights cities, looking at the goal 11, 2030 Sustainable Development Agenda of the UN, and the new role of the ombudsman as a crucial actor of open government, so as to promote the relationship between participatory democracies and human rights, as well as between rights and local resources. So the importance is to revitalize even the English Magna Carta encouraged the citizen institutional incorporation, historically experienced by the Italian medieval city states. And now we have a great debate connecting fiscal responsibility and regionalism in Italy, and the right to be heard from local government. And now, but the contemporary, for example, Singaporean info states that leads to help us to look at global governance and local action. So in this comparative framework, the empiric practices suggested by the Canadian local debate seems pass through the taxpayer rights comparative literature, the constitutional framework, and its historical combination of common law and statute law models, revealing as a new paradigm of intervention to overcome the inadequacies when aiming to foster an unprecedented institutional dialogical argument. And that is located with the supported with the right to experiment, the source of creativity made by taxpayer advocates. If we look at the United States jurisprudence, where taxes are the lifeblood of the government, the response is that it's the taxpayers who provide the lifeblood, as the former US National Taxpayer Advocate said. So going to conclusion, starting from the Town Hall Forum, the authentic constitutional space the Canadian Constitution set aside for what the Canadian Supreme Court defined as a continuous process of discussion and evolution that reminds us to the historical roots of the Italian medieval cities. And I'm just mentioning the Supreme Court 1998 landmark reference of Quebec, which is reflected in the right of each participant not to initiate constitutional change, starting from the assumption that the Constitution is more than a written text. So how to change the constitutional order? To include, one option is to include dialogue as a change driver in its role of fostering the classic image of competing ideas and robust debates, which dates back to English philosophers like Milton and Stuart Mill, that has mentioned from the founding fathers, Italian founding fathers, when saying that in the local autonomies, we find the growing of the individual, and then pass through the jurisprudence of the US Supreme Court and still shape the Canadian constitutional arrangement defined since 1998 as the marketplace of ideas. So free trading ideas, marketplace of ideas, the ability to express ourselves, to create a healthy democracy. And even as national reporter from the Observatory of Protection of Taxpayer Rights, I think that, to put it differently, the step forward made by the court in 1998 seems now more than ever to be decisive, constitutional background to be revitalized, in a city-oriented perspective, because the Canadian system, better than others, is predicated on the faith that in the marketplace of ideas, the best solution, and I want to add, the best solution cities tailor-made to public problems will rise to the top. Thanks a lot for your attention.
Thanks very much, Giovanna. So we've gone from the very top down federal equalization to municipalities to the very bottom up. Let's hear from citizen taxpayers. Where those two meet, maybe we'll talk about in the discussion. Over to Remy, and I believe you're going to be sharing your screen.
Yes, but not now. So first of all, I just wanted to thank Professor Desrosiers, Professor Slack, the other members of this panel. I'm very glad to participate to this conference, especially because it's the first time that I participate to a panel abroad. So just in this respect, I will try to be as clear as possible. I'm sorry if I do not pronounce some words properly. I haven't had the occasion to practice my English for quite some time now. This being said, tonight I'm going to talk about equalization schemes and procedures in metropolitan areas, and I will mainly focus on two different cases, two European cases. I mean the cases of the Greater Paris Metropolis and the case of the Greater London Authority, because there are two cases that are at the core of my main doctoral research. And I will talk about these two specific cases because equalization schemes and procedures, well, they are quite common issue in global metropolises. So maybe a comparison can be useful. Maybe there is some lessons that can be drawn from this comparison. And just to begin my speech, I wanted to underline the fact that last spring, the president of the Greater Paris Metropolis, as well as the mayor of London, both announced that they would take immediate action in financial perspective, immediate action to tackle the severe consequences of the current health crisis. And to this end, the president of the Greater Paris Metropolis announced that he would create a special emergency financial grant worth 15 million euros. And in the meantime, the mayor of London, together with the London boroughs, announced that he would implement a London recovery program with an initial funding worth 33 million pounds. So two specific cases showing how important metropolises have become in public governance. They are important when dealing with critical situations, but also when it comes to urban cohesion or local economic growth, for instance. And since the beginning of my speech, I have been mentioning the notion of metropolis. And, well, what is a metropolis? The metropolization process, as I call it, refers to the growing importance of cities, which is the cumulative factors of both a high concentration of people and a high concentration of economic activities within urban center. But also, metropolization process refers to an increase of territorial interdependence between the urban center and its outskirts. And this process implies both the creation of institutional arrangements and also the organization of some sort of financial solidarity between the richest places of the metropolis and the poorest places of the metropolis. And the main question underpinning my speech today is just to know how this financial solidarity should be organized so that it provides a fair share of wealth to every part of the metropolis, first question, but also how the wealth created into the metropolis can be shared on the national scale, because metropolises are not isolated islands. They contribute a great deal to economic growth, to national economic growth, so they should contribute to national equalization policy. And before talking about Paris and London, I just need to give some theoretical explanations about what I want to talk about. So equalization. Well, financial equalization, it implies a reallocation of wealth that seeks to balance the resources available to multiple local governments in a particular area. And when it comes to financial equalization in the light of local autonomy, well, it can be a quite puzzling question, a quite dazzling issue, because local autonomy fundamentally relies on local differentiation. If the local governments are different, it's because they make different choices. And if they make different choices, there is no need for any equalization procedures. But that does not take into account the fact that usually local governments, well, they are not put on an equal footing in a financial perspective. So that's where equalization comes to play. And equalization mechanisms, well, they can be either vertical, meaning that the state provides funding to the poorest places, or it can be horizontal, meaning that the richest localities of a particular place transfer a fraction of their resources to the poorer localities. In the wake of metropolitan governance, horizontal equalization seems to be the most important because it creates some sense of territorial unity between the richest segment of the metropolis and the poorest segment of the metropolis. And equalization is not always easy to implement. There are three main criticisms here. I will not be very long about them. I don't have much time, but three main questions. First question, what should be equalized? What are the territorial gaps that needs to be equalized because they are unfair, because they create some unfair financial burden? First question. Second question, how they should be compensated? In what amount should they be compensated? Third and last question, is there any independence guarantee attached to the mechanisms? Because the idea of equalization is that one public authority transfers a fraction of resources to another public authority. So there could be a meddling risk from the funding authority into the funded authority's decision-making process. And if it's true that these three main criticisms are important, they cannot be an excuse for not implementing equalization in metropolitan areas, because they are highly differentiated places. They create a link between very rich places and very poor places. And to this end, to illustrate that, I will talk about the two cases I mentioned in my introduction. And first, I'm going to talk about the Greater London. So just let me share my screen. Here it is. So the Greater London Authority, well, it was created 20 years ago, a bit more than that, but 20 years ago. It gathers 9 million people, and it is divided into 33 authorities. 33 authorities. Firstly, the City of London there, and secondly, the London boroughs, so the 32 London boroughs. And well, within this metropolis, extreme poverty goes hand in hand with extreme richness. Extreme richness is represented by the City of London, which is one of the richest places in England. But extreme poverty, well, it is represented by the London borough of Wentworth, for example, because this London borough is the English local government with the lowest spending power. So equalization policy here seems to be required. When it comes to Paris, the Greater Paris Metropolis. The Greater Paris Metropolis, it was created 5 years ago. It gathered the city of Paris here and 130 other municipalities spread across 12 metropolitan territories. And well, it gathers one of the most important economic places in France, which is the business district of La Défense, which is located there. But it also comprises the entire département de la Seine-Saint-Denis, which is there. And this is the poorest département of mainland France. So equalization seemed to be required there also. But what is important here is that the equalization, the intra-metropolitan equalization procedures that are implemented both in London and in Paris, well, they are not satisfactory. And why? Why? Just because there are a secondary concern. How so? First, in Paris. So the Greater Paris Metropolis, I mentioned it, it was created 5 years ago, but it was created on the express condition that it does not withdraw any resources of the pre-existing authorities. So that explains why the Greater Paris Metropolis has to repay more than 90% of its funding. So the financial circuit is quite complicated, so I will not go into the details, but just to explain how it works. First, the localities, so the 131 localities, transfer to the metropolis the entirety of the local business taxes, which when the Greater Paris Metropolis has paid its operating expenses, it has to reimburse this amount, it has to reimburse its funding. So the effect of this reimbursement is to leave only 50 million euros at the disposal of the metropolis, both for its operating expenses and for equalization policy. And that explains why there has only been one equalization grant initiated by this metropolis in 5 years, the one I mentioned earlier. And how does this work in London? Well, the Greater London Authority, as well as the London boroughs, used to benefit from a centrally administered equalization policy, but that changed in 2013 with the implementation of the business rate retention scheme. So the idea of this reform is to allow the English local authority to retain a fraction of the business rates and also a fraction of their annual increase. And for London, the reform went further because both the Greater London Authority and the London boroughs were allowed to retain an increased fraction of these business rates. And to this end, the GLA and the London boroughs created a London pilot pool, which is administered by the City of London. And the City of London decides how the business rates return should be shared between the different members. And the main idea of this London pilot pool is that every part of the metropolis receives the same amount of funding than if the pool wasn't put in place in the first place. And if there is any net collective benefit from one year to another, then equalization policy can be implemented within London. And since 2018, there has been a collective net benefit that was about 200 to 300 million pounds annually. And the amount used for equalization purpose is just 100 million pounds a year. So in both cases, London and Paris, the main important factor is that every pre-existing authority benefits from the same amount of funding than before. But if these metropolises are considered as territorial units, well, they appear both to be highly favored places compared to the national territory. Just imagine, the GDP of London is about 500 billion pounds annually. It's about a quarter of the UK's wealth. The GDP of the Greater Paris Metropolis is about 500 billion euros annually. It is 1/4 of France's wealth. These figures are higher than the GDP of several European countries, such as Belgium or Sweden. So these two metropolises are favored places, and they should contribute to the national wealth sharing programs. And it's always complex to articulate the different procedures, articulate the intra-metropolitan procedures and the extra-metropolitan procedures, because one should reach a balance between fair compensation on the one hand and an acceptable financial burden on the other hand. And well, this balance is not reached in both cases. First, in London, well, the national equalization policy in England relies on the business rate retention scheme. I mentioned it earlier. And the idea of this national equalization policy is that the national government designates the richest places in England, and these richest places have to pay a tariff to the national government, which in turn uses these tariffs to fund the financial support for the poorest places in England. And since 2018, the London pilot pool has been considered as a tariff authority, and it has had to reimburse 2 to 3 billion pounds annually. So 2 to 3 billion pounds annually for national equalization procedure, 100 million pounds for intra-metropolitan equalization procedure. So definitely the balance is not reached here. And when it comes to the Greater Paris metropolis, well, the issue is not the same, because the metropolis has completely been set aside by the national government. The metropolis of Paris is not included in the national equalization policy. Since 2010, there has been a surge in the number of horizontal equalization policy. There is a mechanism for the municipalities. There is a mechanism for the combined authorities. There is a mechanism for the département. There is a mechanism for the regions. And the metropolis is not included in any of these mechanisms. The wealth relocation works is based on other scales, other territorial scales. So that questions the relevance of this metropolis, because it's unable to organize financial solidarity within its borders and outside its borders. And this will be my conclusion here. When one look at metropolitan reform, it's always important to look at the equalization policies that are attached to these reforms, because they are a clear hint of the completeness of the metropolitan reform. Thank you for your attention. I will be very glad to answer to your questions if there are any. And again, thank you.
Thank you very much, Remy. So now you're talking about regional, well, both vertical and horizontal equalization. Just for the Canadian audience, the terms that Remy was using, like business rate retention scheme. So the business rate in the UK is the non-residential property tax. And it was for many years levied by the national government and returned across the country on a per capita basis. Remy, correct me if I'm wrong. But since then, in more recent years, as Remy has suggested, the central government has allowed the business rates, the non-residential property taxes collected in larger and larger proportions, going back to the municipalities where they were collected. Yes. That's just for the Canadian audience, a little explanation. Yeah. Thank you. Danielle.
Thank you very much, Enid, and thank you to the presenters. Today I will really discuss each of the papers, because I received the papers in advance last week. So I read them last week, and I will comment on the papers. So specific, I think, issues that I raised that could help the authors improve their drafts, but also I want to speak about the interactions, potential interactions, complementarity among these three excellent papers. So I will start with Mary Janigan's paper, which makes a case for the creation of a federal equalization program for larger cities in Canada. I found her proposal really intriguing, and looking at the chat, I think many people do as well. And I very much agree that replacing the many federal programs targeting cities with an equalization system that will offer them consolidated support with no strings attached is an idea that we should explore. Yet the paper does not really discuss in a systematic way the relationship between the proposed federal municipal equalization program and existing provincial transfers to cities, an issue that Enid actually just raised earlier. So I will let her maybe comment on this later. And I will move on and talk about another issue I think that could be certainly clarified. And it's the relationship between vertical imbalance and horizontal imbalance, the way we define these terms in Canada, not the way Rémi Poirot defines them in his paper. It's a bit different here, but I will use the Kenyan definition. So in Mary's paper, there is, I think, an extensive discussion about vertical imbalance, which is about unequal fiscal capacity between different levels of government, and the need to increase the fiscal resources of cities through intergovernmental transfers. And that's really important. But in Canada, equalization is not the federal equalization program created in 1957 that Mary knows very well about and has written a wonderful book tracing its history. The federal equalization program is primarily about horizontal imbalance, not vertical imbalance. It's about, and she knows that, her book is called The Art of Sharing for a reason. It's about horizontal fiscal redistribution. It's about addressing inequalities among different jurisdictions. In the case of federal equalization, we talk about the 10 provinces located at the same level of government, right? So there is a distinction here, and it seems that in her paper, Mary is conflating these two issues, and her equalization program seems to be addressing both vertical imbalance, that is the fact that municipalities, large cities, have limited fiscal capacity compared to, say, the federal government, or also perhaps the provinces, which is vertical imbalance, and then horizontal imbalance, which is about inequalities among municipalities. And these are two different issues that are related, but you need to draw a line between them analytically before you can address their relationship. So here it seems that Marie Janigan wants a municipal equalization system to tackle both vertical and fiscal imbalance, but her paper makes a case for equalization mainly with claims about vertical imbalance rather than horizontal imbalance. But equalization at the federal level is mainly about horizontal imbalance. So she's using a model, federal equalization, that tackles horizontal imbalance primarily. Of course, there is a dimension with vertical imbalance, but vertical imbalance is tackled through other means. But then she uses that example of federal equalization program, which is primarily about horizontal imbalance, to tackle vertical imbalance, which I think is something that should at least be made explicit and discussed in a clear way. So and if the issue here is about, if equalization is really about horizontal imbalance, as it is the case when we talk about federal equalization towards the provinces, then what are the main patterns of fiscal inequalities among larger cities in Canada? And what do we need, and why do we need to address them beyond simply referring to the history of provincial equalization, the federal program that we have in our country? Back in 1957, a key factor that led to the creation of the federal equalization program for the provinces was the decline of the war-era tax rental agreements between Ottawa and the provinces, and the lack of horizontal redistribution towards Quebec stemming from the provinces' exit from these agreements under Premier Maurice Duplessis. That's the story that Mary tells very well in The Art of Sharing in her most recent book. Today, what factor would drive the creation of a municipal equalization program from the perspective of horizontal imbalance rather than vertical imbalance, which is the main issue Mary discusses in her paper? What inequalities among larger cities require us to think about the creation of an equalization system aimed at addressing not only vertical, but also horizontal imbalance? These are questions that Mary could address in the next draft of her paper. At the same time, to make her proposal more concrete, and that's important, looking at existing municipal equalization programs in other countries, in other federal systems, might be helpful to clarify and illustrate the policy challenges we face in designing and creating municipal equalization program in this country. Although if the goal is mainly to tackle vertical imbalance rather than horizontal imbalance, like the federal equalization system, then perhaps the term equalization is misplaced here. And we should use a different term not to create conceptual confusions. But I really like your idea. I'm not too sure about the terminology and the way it's framed. So let's look at other countries. Where should we look at? I mean, other countries have programs that resemble what Mary has in mind in a way or another, not exact, carbon copy, but something that we should maybe study to see how we might be able to do things in our country. One case here would be Brazil. Of course, it's a federal system that's a very different animal from Canada because municipalities have a strong constitutional status. So that's something to take into account. But they do have fiscal equalization for both the states and the municipalities. Closer to home, the United States from 1972 to 1986 ran a really interesting program. They don't have equalization anymore in the US, but they add some elements of equalization with revenue sharing. Revenue sharing that was enacted under Nixon and was phased out gradually under Reagan. And this program addressed both vertical and horizontal imbalance, and it dealt with both state and local governments. So I think that will be an interesting place to look at south of the border. So, so I think these are just, and I want to talk about international comparison here because, we should not try to reinvent the wheel in Canada when other countries have done things that, are quite similar to the proposals that we might have in mind. So we should always look for potential foreign models, although we cannot adapt them. Copy them. We should only translate them into our own institutions, our own language. But we should look abroad for potential best practices and policy alternatives. And I think here in the case of federal municipal equalization, I think that Brazil and the United States with revenue sharing between 1972 and 1986 might be good places to start. Now, international comparison brings me to Rémi Poirot's paper, which is a comparative paper that deals with equalization within two major cities in Europe. The Greater Paris Metropolis, Métropole du Grand Paris, and the Greater London Authority. In the context of today's session, this discussion shifts our attention to two issues about equalization not central to Mary Jannigan's paper, but useful to grasp the complexity of the fiscal environment in which large cities operate. The first issue is internal inequalities within large cities and metropolitan areas and how to address them. This is very important. So when we talk about fiscal issues regarding cities, it's not just about vertical imbalance or perhaps horizontal imbalance among cities, but it's also about internal inequalities within large metropolitan areas, something we see in a number of provinces in this country. Clearly, in the case of both Paris and London, enormous inequalities exist within large metropolitan areas, and Rémi is very clear about, he provides evidence of really how these cities are both very rich in a way, and at the same time, they are the site of strong patterns of inequality, especially when you look at the entire metropolitan area. In both Paris and London, direct yet limited equalization programs have been enacted to reduce what in Canada we call horizontal fiscal imbalance by offering extra support to poorer municipalities within the metropolitan area. Simultaneously, although internally stratified, taken as a whole, larger metropolitan areas such as Paris and London are wealthy compared to other regions of their respective country, which leads Rémi Poirot to address the issue of how these areas should be treated as far as broader regional equalization and fiscal transfers should be considered across the country in which Paris and London are located, so France and the UK, which I think is a fascinating issue that we don't really talk about that much in Canada, but it's an interesting, I think, topic to raise. So these two issues, both internal metropolitan equalization and the role of large cities within broader forms of fiscal redistribution, and horizontal fiscal inequality are both fascinating and relevant to a discussion of municipal equalization in Canada, and they reveal some of our blind spots, including those that are apparent in Marie's excellent paper. Because as I said, these are 3 great papers. I'm just trying here to stimulate debate and help the authors think about the issues they raise in terms of, I think, in terms of Rémi Poirot, I think that the paper might gain from greater exposure to discussions about fiscal federalism and the literature about fiscal federalism, which is, I think, very useful to understand issues of vertical and horizontal fiscal imbalance, and that using this literature more systematically could actually help draw lessons for fiscal transfers more generally, even beyond the municipal level. Now let's meet, I will turn very briefly to Giovanna Tieghi's paper, which raises an important issue that reveals a potential black spot of the other 2 papers featured in this session, the relationship between democracy and fiscal policy. While Marie and Rémi focus primarily on policy structures, Giovanna draws our attention on the importance of democratic deliberation in municipal fiscal affairs through an analysis of the Canadian taxpayer town halls. Although the writing is sometimes rather abstract and a bit hard to follow, so that's something that will have to be improved here, the paper focuses, the paper forces us to address the democratic side of municipal fiscal policy, which in retrospect raises issues about the theme of equalization policy discussed in the 2 other papers discussed in this session. Is democracy necessarily favorable to horizontal fiscal redistribution, or can citizens living in wealthier areas of the city or of the country use deliberative mechanisms to reduce such redistribution to their advantage? In the municipal context, is more democracy necessarily favorable to redistribution? If not, then perhaps technocratic structures like the arm's length bodies that Marie Janigan alludes to in her paper might be more appropriate to manage equalization program that democratic institutions driven mainly by electoral pressures might fail to really protect. This in the end leads us to the question of whether democracy is always a positive force as far as the promotion of egalitarian social policy outcomes and redistribution are concerned. And this is an old question in social science research. And I don't have an answer for this, but I think this paper, Giovanna's paper, raises really big questions about the relationship between democracy and fiscal policy, especially fiscal redistribution, which is at the core of this session. I'm not saying that this democracy here is bad, of course. I support the idea of a liberal democracy, but just like when we talk about individual rights, when we discuss fiscal redistribution and good public policy, perhaps limited tempered democracy is more effective than really the belief that participation is always favorable to solidarity and redistribution. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Daniel. And I would ask all of the other speakers to come back on with their videos. We do have some questions in the chat, but I do feel that I have to give you each an opportunity to respond to Danielle's questions. So Mary, if you want to go first and talk a little bit about vertical versus horizontal fiscal imbalance. And let me just add one of the comments in the chat from Andy Sancton, who says he doesn't see how there could be federal horizontal equalization among Canadian cities because cities in different provinces have different functional responsibilities. So for example, in Ontario, municipalities have to do social services, but in other, pay for, partly fund social services, but in other provinces they don't. And that sort of also fits into some of what Daniel was saying. So I'll give you just a couple minutes because we'd like to go to some of the audience questions as well.
I thought Daniel's comments were fabulous. I wish that I had heard them before I completed the paper. They're wonderful. As to, I did consider that cities have different functions. I decided, look, we have to look, that's another one of the reasons I wanted to look at revenues. And to shorten my paper, I didn't explain that there was a degree of horizontal imbalance taken into account. So you look at the revenues, not what they're spending it on, but you look at, let's say, 5 sources of revenues, 5, 6. We're not going to go into where federal equalization for the provinces goes with dozens. Look at what each city of the 15 or 22 raises from those 5 sources of revenues. In the paper, I should have explicitly, Danielle's right, talked about horizontal inequality, but the paper talks about how the equalization pot could be distributed based upon the fiscal capacity per capita of those cities. And you could see Ottawa getting less than Toronto, because Toronto is actually in a worse situation than Ottawa. Ottawa is actually one of the wealthiest cities. So that factor is in the paper, not as explicit as it should have been. And Danielle, thank you. I owe you.
Okay. Rami, if you want to respond to Daniel's comments, and also Natalie's asked if you could offer some suggestions about how to design a better system. Why aren't the 2 sites, why aren't London and Paris not changing the schemes they have?
Well, for this question about why these 2 metropolises do not change these schemes, well, for Paris, it's highly complex because the Parisian region in which the metropolis was created is the most fragmented place in France. There is 131 municipalities within the metropolis, but this metropolis is located into one region. This region is divided into 8 départements, and these 8 départements comprise more than 1,000 municipalities. So it's highly fragmented, and the national government has never wanted to create a real equalization policy to give an important place to the metropolis. So it's a state matter. The national government has to decide what to do, and it does not know what to do because of this fragmentation. And regarding the criticism about fiscal federalism, it's true that I haven't mentioned it too much in my paper, but also because fiscal federalism is not something really discussed in France and in the UK, just because we are not in a federation, and so fiscal federalism is always a bit exotic. I mean, I think it's not always easy to talk about fiscal federalism when you are not in a federation. So that's why I didn't want to delve deeper into this subject.
Yeah, I want to ask that. I just want to say that in the UK, because of devolution, it's not fiscal federalism, but if you look at the Barnett formula for Scotland, for example, it's quite interesting. So I will not discard fiscal federalism altogether.
Yes, but I didn't want to talk about this devolution process because I stayed within England. So England is quite a unitary system. So that's why I didn't want to mention this.
Absolutely. Good point. Thanks.
Okay, Giovanna, so democracy and fiscal policy, democracy and redistribution maybe don't work so well together. And we sort of said that at the beginning of this session. How would you address those comments?
Oh, I just want to thank, because I think we are greatly a combination of different viewpoints, but I think they perfectly match, considering the big problem of democracy and fiscal policy. So I just thank you, Professor Bland, for his comments, his great comments for me too. You actually are giving me the chance to better implement my topic, because I actually had considered fiscal policy from the bottom-up approach, so looking at the citizen, but with the idea of the complexity of the regionalism and fiscal policy we actually live in Italy. So it's a very big problem. And what I want to focus on was connected with asymmetries. So with some Italian experiments of different level of autonomy, and that means territorial asymmetries and economic identities, proximity, and participation. That the idea that autonomy cannot be imposed or from legal command, but has to grow up from citizen needs and preferences, that's democracy. But at the same time, the complexity of contemporary jurisdictions, federal, regional, or even like united jurisdiction, has to go back to the idea that subsidiarity means not just solidarity, and equality doesn't just mean flattening, but a kind of appreciation of differences. And that's what sometimes we need. So we need to create a redistribution, fiscal policy distributive, but at the same time, recognizing what are the main, the major entities and the major capacities of each territorial government. And that's what I think could be helped by local democracies to go up.
Okay, thank you. Please put your questions in the chat. I'll go through the questions that we have so far. Remy, I guess this one may be for you. You may know a little bit about the history of Toronto, but in 1998, there was a two-tier government, a metropolitan government and lower tiers, and they were amalgamated into one city of Toronto. And you know, a lot of us said it was a city that was too big and too small. It was too big to be locally responsive and too small to deal with the regional issues. It didn't save costs. The whole reason the province imposed it was to save costs. It didn't do that. But one of the things it did do was some equalization. But our questioner doesn't think it was enough. And she says, it's Janet Davis. She says, Toronto struggled and still does with harmonization after amalgamation. And the question is, do you equalize by internal redistribution or equalization harmonization through revenue growth? Is national or provincial funding needed to enable this kind of equalization? Any of your experiences in London and Paris help you answer that question?
Well, I will mainly talk about Paris because this question is really important in Paris. The question is to know how this solidarity should be organized, and should the equalization be a revenue equalization or a service equalization? And well, in France and in Paris, but in France in general, the choice has been made to consider equalization as an accounting issue. So always the equalization policy relies on accounting perspective. So we equalize the revenues based on the number of inhabitants and also some extra cost drivers that needs to be the same for the entire country. Because in France, we have a long tradition of equity and equality. So definitely revenue equalization is the most important. In London, the choice has been quite different. It's both a revenue equalization, but also a service equalization. The idea is that for now, the revenues collected by the revenues collected thanks to the business rates are not sufficient to provide a true revenue equalization between the different localities. So, because these revenues are not sufficient, 100 million pounds annually, it has been decided to create a single investment pot common to the entire metropolis. And this strategic investment pot, as it is called, is used to provide a service equalization policy, but it is just in the weight of another reform to provide more funding to the London metropolis. So no simple answer, but
these are not simple questions. No, thank you. Mary, I have a question for you from Nathalie Desrosiers about what you think the next steps would be, drawing on your historical work about provincial equalization. And let me just add a little bit to that question, because one of the huge problems that we face, and I've been doing this for a long time, as you know, is data. I mean, if you ask me if Vancouver gets more provincial grants than Toronto, it would take me days to find an answer to that. There's no single source that compares the municipal finances of cities across this country. So as part of your next steps, maybe you could add something about data. Maybe this is a great opportunity to get that data collected.
That is a good idea. The Federation of Canadian Municipalities and the Urban Institute both seem to collect some data, but I don't see enough. I think perhaps that Giovanna might have a solution there. At some point, citizen taxpayers are going to start pressuring their governments, their municipalities, their provinces, Ottawa, to see better use of their tax dollars in their cities. And I think perhaps that kind of pressure is the only way to go. I mean, politically, this is not a top-down issue. This requires political pressure. And you can't expect Ottawa or the provinces to respond kindly to the idea of non-conditional, no application forms, no accountability, use of equalization funds. Years ago, the Royal Commission on Dominion Provincial Affairs looked at what would happen if they gave out various grants to different provinces. This was in the late Depression. It came out in 1940 in wartime. And they decided the only thing that would work was voter pressure on governments to make sure money is spent well. And I think if Canadians knew that there were 21 different federal departments and agencies handing out funds, there might be a little more inclination to push for reform. I hope, anyway.
Okay, thank you. Giovanna, did you want to jump in?
Yeah, I definitely thank Mary for her consideration. And that's why I was saying that we are matching each other. So because it's just the other side of the medal, as Mary said. And that's what happened in Italy. So starting from the idea of recognizing more autonomy to different regions, we had to go to ask the Constitutional Court for a consultative referendum to ask people what's their thought about that. And that was not directly connected with fiscal policy, but indirectly, that was the way to push local authorities, politicians to go through the more autonomy for that region. That's my region, actually, that's Veneto, for asking more autonomy in order to better manage administrative policy powers, even if not yet fiscal policy, as we don't have the chance to have referendum on taxes here in Italy. But it's the first step forward to get to make pressure to local government. And in that case, the Constitutional Court said that we could have a local consultative referendum to ask the citizens if they agreed or not to have more autonomy, local autonomy. That means the connection between autonomy and participation of taxpayers.
Okay, a lot of the questions in the chat are very local, very not only Canadian, but very Toronto. So somebody's asked about the failed experiment of pooling of social service costs across the Greater Toronto area. So following the amalgamation, the cost of social, well, I guess it was following the who does what, where some of the services were downloaded onto municipalities and some of social service costs were downloaded onto municipalities. And the province came up with a scheme where GTA, Greater Toronto Area municipalities, pooled the social service costs and then gave them out on a per capita basis or something to each of the municipalities. So there was an implicit redistribution. Danielle, you've answered this. Do you want to answer it out loud, which you've done in the chat?
Yes. So the discussion in the chat, I was answering to a comment by Andy Sancton. That's what you want me to do.
Okay. It's the order that these things come in. Well, I guess then maybe I will answer it. I think it was a failed experiment because it was a classic case of taxation without representation. It was a case where everybody had to feed into that pool of funds, but nobody had a say over where that money was spent. So it was taxation without representation. I think that's why it failed. Did you want to comment on Andy's earlier comment then?
Well, I think that the issue of one topic that I will find fascinating, I don't know if there is research about this because it's not really my area, but the impact of democracy, local democracy on redistribution. There is a lot of literature about this in the US. And so what I've seen is, gives me pause, is that especially depending on how the municipalities are actually, designed in terms of the layout and so forth, there is a lot of, race to the bottom in terms of municipal taxation that can occur, but also people in say wealthier suburbs or wealthier areas of the city who fight against redistribution within the municipality or within the metropolitan area. So that's why I say here that, it's go back to this issue of democracy, whether it's actually always favorable to redistribution. Depending on the institutional context, it might have a totally opposite impact. And I think it's just important to keep that in mind. And it depends on how the policies are designed, and depends on the layout of the cities. And that is something that still we have to think about the provinces. I think today that's really interesting. We have not talked that much about the provinces. Mary's focus was on the federal government and the cities. And provincial democracy is also important. And of course, Remy, you're in a different world because you're not in a federal world, so which is exotic to you. But I think what's happening too in provincial politics is important in terms of redistribution within each province, and what's happening too in terms of provincial redistribution and transfers that affect municipalities. And I think too, last thing I want to say is that
okay, because one more question.
Focus on big cities, but smaller municipalities often struggle, and we should not forget about smaller municipalities and just focus on the big cities, because even if there's a growing percentage of the population living in large cities like Toronto, Montreal, Vancouver, or Calgary, I think that smaller cities and even towns struggle with fiscal issues, and provinces deal with this in very different ways, but we have to keep that in mind too, and not just talk about the big cities.
And that's why we have the town halls for even for small cities.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Yes.
And
I agree.
Alexandra Flynn has just said that's a very important point about smaller cities, and it's true. And the equalization program in Ontario for municipalities actually just goes to the small rural and communities and not to any of the cities at all. It's 4:59. I know they're going to close us down. Natalie's asked a great question about, oh, and I've just lost it. If you want to talk about the legitimacy of redistribution, can we get voters to agree to redistribution? COVID-19 makes clear that we cannot ignore inequalities. Have our values changed? I've got like 30 seconds from each of you. Mary. Unmute.
I'm hoping our values haven't changed, but also, you know, like the federal program, any equalization is a deeply pragmatic way of going about keeping a federation together. It's not just a value-driven exercise, it's also pragmatism. You want to keep unity, that's what you do.
Good point. Giovanna.
Yes, unity combined with pluralism.
Okay, Remy.
Well, I do not think that this equalization policy can work, at least in France and in England, because voters do not want to share their wealth in both cases. It's why these metropolises do not work properly today.
Great, and COVID hasn't changed that apparently. Daniel, very quickly, last word.
Well, I think to me, it's also about power relations and what's happening in terms of elections and parties. And the pandemic might actually shift partisan patterns that may actually help bring about more progressive policies or not. The story is not over yet. It's too early to tell.
Okay, well, what a great way to end, knowing we have to come back and sort out all these problems year after year. This has been a terrific panel. I can't believe the hour and a half has gone by so quickly. All that's left for me is to say thank you, Mary, thank you, Giovanna, Remy, and Danielle. Great panel. Thank you.